Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the next episode of Ships of War, the series where I take historic vessels, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And I hope to accomplish two things with these videos. One is to situate these ships in their historical context, and also to pick on them. I'll use the word pick on them in a particular game system and just try to get a sense of how well they have been represented in the said game system, whether they've been treated fairly, maybe they've been treated unfairly. Sometimes there might even be interesting tweaks that have been made for game purposes, or, as in many cases, they have actually been represented quite well by the game system as far as we're able to determine and in relation to their careers. And today I'm very excited to be coming back to Vuca Simulation's wonderful game, The Chase of the Bismarck, Operation Rönnegung of 1941. This is a game I have covered quite recently on the channel, and I could not resist the thought of coming back to it just to look at a couple of the warships that played a very important part in the Bismarck campaign, but which, like a lot of the smaller vessels, do tend to get subsumed by the, exciting and terrifying and also very tragic tales of the big capital ships. So, as you can see, I am going to be looking at the two heavy cruisers, HMS Norfolk and the German Prinz Eugen. So what I've got here, and again, you can see why I love Vuca simulations, the sheer beauty of the components, which I will not dwell on because I have said as much many, many times in my other videos. Before I proceed, I do want to do something else because as one of you pointed out in the comments, Ed, it was you. Thank you so much for bringing this to my attention and reminding me, sir. I think I'd largely failed to mention the indomitable and very productive Jack Green, the designer of the original game as published by Avalon Hill, and who had a close working relationship with Vuca when they launched this one. Jack has sadly shuffled off this mortal coil, which is a very, very huge loss to the wargaming world. This was not the only title of his that I have, and I've on the whole really enjoyed every Jack Green game that I've ever played, even the really involved ones, which sometimes takes a bit of doing. And also a nod really to a childhood favourite film. You can't really talk about the Bismarck campaign without mentioning the superb film Sink the Bismarck. Which, for all its very minor historical problems, is an absolutely cracking story and the best and probably only film ever made about the Bismarck campaign. I watched it when I was a boy and it fired my imagination. So yes, anyway, that brings me back to the present day and sitting once more in front of these lovely components here. Now, why these two ships in particular? Well, one of the problems with the German side is that Bismarck herself has been analysed to death. You can find so much information out on her. You can also find a lot of arguments about her out there. And far, far better people than me have covered her on many channels and in publications. So in terms of what I said earlier, I wanted to give her little counterpart, Prinz Eugen, a bit more of a spot in the limelight. Of course, the German deployment gives you a very tiny choice of ships. It's either Bismarck or Prinz Eugen, really. So that led me to wondering what would be a good match for Prinz Eugen, and that led me to HMS Norfolk, because despite her age, Norfolk was one of the more capable heavy cruisers on the British side, certainly a very powerful vessel. And although she was roughly a decade older than Prinz Eugen, she, as we'll see, I hope, she could hold her own very well in terms of design and capability against the German ship. So in a sense, she is the really obvious one. I could have picked Suffolk, but I just like Norfolk's profile a bit better. Sorry, Suffolk. And the two definitely crossed paths, albeit indirectly, because of course Norfolk and Suffolk are the ones who first pick up Admiral Lutyen's task force as he's trying to sneak through the Denmark Strait. And although they don't really get within sensible gunnery range of each other at some point, Prinz Eugen and Norfolk could well have ended up being direct antagonists if things had been very different. And I think at one point, Prinz Eugen was directed to take Norfolk and Suffolk under fire on the 24th of May, if possible. But the conditions didn't allow it in any way. Prinz Eugen had better things to do at the time, so that never happened. So what I'm going to do is just launch into a bit of history, because as you can see from the two ship cards here, these ships seem quite similar in terms of their capabilities, and they are, which is why they make such a great point for comparison. But just a bit of a reminder to go over the terrain, so we all know what we're talking about here. In Chase of the Bismarck, the evasion rating is an expression of the ship's maximum speed. So they've credited Prinz Eugen with 32 knots and Norfolk with 31. Torpedo rating is their torpedo battery. Prinz Eugen has 12, Norfolk has 4. I will be coming back to that later. Radar rating. So both ships were, of course, radar equipped in 1941. Prinz Eugen has a 2-bar radar, and what that symbol means is that her radar is slightly more capable than Norfolk's. Again, I'll come back to that and unpack it in a bit more detail. The hull rating is an expression of the ship's survivability. So the two are pretty close, but Prinz Eugen's got a bit of an edge in terms of, well, she takes more beating before she goes under effectively. And of course, fairly self-explanatory, primary armament at the bow, primary armament at the stern, and that is a factor of their protection rating. And lastly, I've included these two counters down here because that little number over there is their maximum fuel capacity expressed in units in the game. So 9 for Prinz Eugen and 10 for Norfolk. So before I launch into the direct comparison, let's have a look at careers, really, because both these ships had quite an interesting time, even if Prinz Eugen's was a bit more brief than Norfolk's. So I'll begin with Norfolk. Let's do, no, this is subjective. I think Norfolk is the prettier of the two, but I'll say age before beauty. So HMS Norfolk was commissioned in 1930, and she was one of the new generation of treaty cruisers that had been, I won't say forced on British designers, but every major navy was doing this. The Washington Naval Treaty had created this culture where if you wanted to build your big heavy cruisers up to treaty limits, they had to be within the 10,000 ton range, and most people were finding you could get away with 8-inch guns as a primary battery. And so Norfolk was part of this large generation of ships, which the Royal Navy colloquially called the county class because of their names, Norfolk, Devonshire, Suffolk, and so forth. But there were quite a few subclasses, and Norfolk was one of a subclass of 2 vessels. She's one of the later ones, so she benefits quite a lot from the lessons which are learned from her predecessor cruisers. And as completed, she being part of a well-established design, there weren't that many kinks in the ship that needed to be worked out. She works up fairly quickly, and she does what heavy cruisers of her type normally did in the Royal Navy in the interwar period. She traveled a lot to foreign stations. She was fitted out and was capable of serving as a flagship on places as far afield as the China Station, the East Indies, the Mediterranean. Anywhere where you didn't have a battleship available for the admiral, so he'd set up shop in a heavy cruiser instead. And so she did that for about almost a decade until the war clouds gathered, and then of course she had to return to home waters for duties there when war broke out. She had an extremely busy time during the war. She was involved right from the start, and if I rattle off everything she did, we'll be here for a very long time. So I'm just going to talk about the highlights of her career, and especially those that relate to Prinz Eugen and the German heavy units. So She did, as I say, take part in on the British side on during Exercise Rhine, and she did along with Suffolk find and shadow Bismarck and Prinz Eugen originally. After the dreadful engagement of the 24th of May 1941, where the British lost Hood, she accompanied Prince of Wales as that ship continued to follow the German task force. She was also in on the death of Bismarck on the 27th of May 1941. In fact, she was rather enthusiastic as participation goes. She fired an estimated, it was nearly 538-inch rounds at Bismarck, and and in fact tried to put 8 torpedoes into her for a good measure. Now, none of Norfolk's torpedoes hit, and most of her shells didn't really do much to Bismarck, but one of them is credited with destroying, or at least taking offline Norfolk's Bismarck's forward gunnery director. So there you go. There's a fine example of a cruiser punching above her weight. Bismarck wasn't the only German capital ship she had a hand in sinking. She was also there in December 1943 when the Royal Navy's Home Fleet hunted down and sank Scharnhorst. In fact, at one critical point in the engagement, she and her two accompanying cruisers got the drop on Scharnhorst. Weirdly enough, Norfolk demonstrates a predilection for slapping other ships' detection systems. She put a hit on Scharnhorst that disabled her aft radar and didn't really do that unfortunate German ship any favours. Now, she did take some comeback from Scharnhorst, which I'll touch on a bit later. Some of that damage resulted in her having her X-turret removed in a refit in 1944 and additional anti-aircraft guns added. But the very busy ship that was HMS Norfolk served throughout the Second World War and lasted quite a bit beyond. She was finally sold for breaking up in 1950. Now, Prinz Eugen, for her part, has, as I say, a much shorter career. So this ship is work begins in the late 1930s in the wake of the Anglo-German naval agreement. The German government decides that they are going to invest in some heavy cruisers. Now, this is not a very straightforward decision because some in the German Navy do not really see the point of these ships. Mainly because they don't quite understand what role they play in the fleet mix that Germany's building up. Everyone talks about them in terms of them being commerce raiders, and they don't seem to fit that bill very well. Some critics say they're overpowered for what they are. Others say that their fuel endurance, and this is quite critical in a commerce raider, is just not up to scratch for a ship that wants to wander very far and sink lots of merchant ships far from its home bases. But be that as it may, the Germans do produce a very capable heavy cruiser in Prinz Eugen. She ends up being in a class of her own because although she's technically a member of the Hipper class, she represents an improvement on the two ships that were built in that class a year or two earlier. And given her dimensional differences, you could almost class her as a separate ship. So she finds herself without that much of a role when war starts, because, of course, the German Navy is a rather unbalanced organization at the start of the Second World War, and its surface units in particular, while they find a lot of initial success commerce raiding, find that they're not it's not going to be the war-winning arm that, say, the U-boat fleet is going to turn into. So Prinz Eugen's first major op outside of German territorial or coastal waters is her trip with Bismarck. And she is very problematic for Admiral Lutyens on that voyage because with her limited range of nearly 7,000 nautical miles. I know that sounds like a lot when you quote the number, but when you consider the Germans have no friendly bases outside of Europe in May 1941, it makes life very difficult. And you have to mess around with things like arranging tankers and secret rendezvous points and all that. It was probably a bit of a relief to Lutyens when he was finally able to cut her loose, and then he just had Bismarck to worry about. Another thing about Prinz Eugen that's worth mentioning at this stage is that she was a very, very modern ship in the sense that she had the best of everything built into her. But a lot of her systems, particularly her high pressure steam propulsion system, suffered from the malaise that often affects new technology, and it was not very reliable. The Americans find this later when at the end of the war, when she's fallen into their hands. So after the Bismarck effort, Prinz Eugen takes part in the Channel Dash in early 1942, which is a major tactical success for the German Navy, but in some respects is also a strategic failure because it means the heavy units are now effectively stuck. It's very hazardous for them to venture out of the Baltic into the North Sea or even transfer up to the coast of Norway. It all has to be done. It all has to be done with a great deal of preparation and a lot of hope that the British don't notice vessel movements. And of course, after the humiliation of the Channel Dash, the British are not in any mood to let German heavy warships wander around with impunity. So Prince Eugen makes a lot of effort to try and get up to Norway and is stymied for various reasons. And in the meantime, the British keep bombing her and trying to damage her. And she even takes a torpedo at one point from the British submarine HMS Trident, which causes a rather extensive damage. And so she spends much of the rest of the war as a training ship until the advance of the Soviet armies gives her a new combatant lease of life, and she conducts a great deal of shore bombardment. On one or two occasions, being almost single-handedly responsible for breaking up Soviet attacks. But the inevitable happens and the war ends, and she's in not that much better a state than the rest of the surviving German fleet is in. Under the terms of the surrender, she was transferred to the United States Navy, where she is recommissioned as USS Prinz Eugen, which has got to be the strangest name any US warships ever had. Happy if you guys want to correct me on that one. She does, however, have one last major contribution to make to both naval and military history, in that she's the only vessel of the Third Reich's Kriegsmarine to be affected by the explosion of a nuclear weapon, or two, in fact, because she's sent to Bikini Atoll for Operation Crossroads, the nuclear bomb tests. Now, in a weird way, this means that she has outlasted HMS Norfolk, because the ship's wreck still lies in very shallow water out there and is now, I think, safe for divers to visit. So Prinz Eugen is still there and has never truly left us, and is there a dive attraction, a very popular one these days. So there we go. I'm sorry, it's a very potted history of both ships, and I know I haven't done either of them justice, but I try to keep these videos a bit on the short side, and a full career breakdown, particularly for Norfolk, would occupy us for a very long time. But all that said, let's get to the fun stuff, because these stats that we see here obviously show the ships as they were in May of 1941. So let's do a little bit of compare and contrast. Now, I know you've got these beautiful illustrations on the cards here, which are really quite amazing. And I've said in one of my other videos, I think they are a nod to the intelligence file sheets that various navies produced, but particularly the US Office of Naval Intelligence, because you can see both from the style and the execution that there's an awful lot of artistic similarity. And I do like these because one problem we have with Prinz Eugen's short life, and of course she never had a peacetime life, is there are good photos of her out there, but there aren't that many. Norfolk, with her decade of peacetime service, is absolutely teeming with photos to her name. But this gives you a nice impression of how the two ships measured up visually. And one thing that strikes you about the two heavy cruisers is how similar they are in general concept. And what I mean by that is, let's look at disposition of armament. You've got the two twin turrets forward, two twin turrets aft. exactly the same layout on the British ship. Now, I don't think any imitating was going on here. It's just that it was a good established concept and it worked in terms of what the designers were trying to do. But of course, both nations put their own stamp on these things. Both ships had reconnaissance aircraft. In fact, Prinz Eugen had three Arado float planes. Norfolk spent most of her career having just the one, her catapults over there. But the other thing is visually, they betray their lineage. Prinz Eugen, to my mind, is a very 1930s sort of a design. It really comes out. And looking at her from a distance, I can sort of see how Hood mistook her for Bismarck when they were both sighted on the 24th of May 1941, because if you're just a fuzzy smudge on the horizon, that layout is not too dissimilar from her much, much larger battleship cousin. Norfolk, of course, is very different. You've got this lovely, almost Art Deco 1920s design, which emphasizes, as the Royal Navy had to, good seakeeping and particularly good habitability. These were very comfortable ships to serve on. They were as roomy and as well ventilated as cruisers could be at the time. And they were generally quite popular ships. And it shows in the hull form. That's definitely a happy marriage of a cruiser hull with, I don't want to call it a mercantile hull form, but it's one that allows an awful lot of room and, crucially, a lot of space for modification. They were being a bit far-sighted there. But let's work across and start with the speed. So we've got 31 knots for Norfolk and 32 for Prinz Eugen. Now, I do wonder about this. I can see why they want Prinz Eugen to be faster in game terms, if only by a smidge. And this is actually something that's quite hard to quantify. So Prinz Eugen, as I say, had a very, very modern high-pressure steam propulsion system. It drove 3 shafts, geared turbines. On trials, she made 32.5 knots, and she generally managed to sustain that speed throughout at least the first half of her operational life. Norfolk on trials achieved 32.3 knots, so that's really, really close. Now, of course, her engines, although well maintained, were a decade old when the Second World War broke out, so you'd expect a little bit of deterioration in performance. But the other thing you have to consider is sea state. I just talked about the two hulls. Now, both represent a different approach to seaworthiness, which are both serviceable in their own way, but one gets the impression that Prinz Eugen, especially with her better form and that classic German Atlantic bow, can cope with heavy weather maybe slightly better than Norfolk can, but I need to be careful what I say, because there's coping with heavy weather and then there's coping with heavy weather at high speed. Now, Norfolk could cope with heavy weather. In fact, she spent most of her peacetime and wartime career coping quite well with heavy weather, but she probably couldn't have maintained her full speed while doing it. If she ever had to sprint in really awful conditions, and her little adventure with Scharnhorst in December 1943 is a good one, her speed could vary between 28 and 30 knots when she was going flat out through awful conditions. Prinz Eugen did manage 32 in really rough conditions too. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, how fair is this? I'm actually tempted to say that if you wanted to give a fairer operational rating, they both probably should be around 30 just to level things off. But I do accept that Prinz Eugen, as the younger, newer ship, could probably push ahead of Norfolk in certain circumstances. Now, what I should mention in relation to her propulsion is that her crew worked miracles during the war, because her engines really were very temperamental and remained so. I'd alluded earlier to the fact that the US Navy had great difficulty with her engines, especially once the German crews who'd instructed them had left. And they were so unreliable that she had to be towed to the Pacific for the nuclear bomb test. So that's just another thing to consider when we think about Prinz Eugen and her propulsion. I have a bit more of an issue with the torpedo rating. So Norfolk has been given a 4 torpedo rating and Prinz Eugen's been given 12. Now, this is important in game terms because as you expend torpedoes in battle, you have to go to port to reload them in this game. And the reason I have an issue with the ratings here is it implies that Norfolk's only got the 4 torpedo shots and then it's all over. Now, cast your mind back and remember I said she'd expended 8 torpedoes at Bismarck on the 27th of May 41, and that is correct. So Norfolk, at the beginning of her life and still in World War II, had 2 torpedo mounts, and they were located on each side. You can see one of them in the shadows just there. So she had 2 quadruple mounts, so 4 torpedo tubes per side, meaning that she had a total of 8 torpedoes available. Now, it's not the case, I think, that they're just crediting her with her armament for one side, because Prinz Eugen's maximum torpedo complement was 12. So she had 4 torpedo launchers, 4 triples, 2 on each side. So if they were only looking at a single broadside, then Prinz Eugen's rating should be 6. So I don't know whether that was just a mistake or whether they were hobbling Norfolk deliberately in this design. I'm not too certain, but anyway, she has been very unfairly treated there. And if I were given a choice in this, I would either up her torpedo number to 8, or if you want to play the single broadside thing, I would reduce Prinz Eugen's rating to 6. Radar. So Norfolk has the slightly more primitive radar relative to Prinz Eugen here. Now, in game terms, there's not actually that much difference. So the reason I say that is because the bar on the radar indicates a different level of effectiveness when you're shadowing another ship. In a way, Prinz Eugen's advantage is a bit moot because the Germans cannot shadow for game purposes in this game. So they do break even on the detection and shadowing because it makes no difference. In combat, single bar and double bar radars perform exactly the same. Now, overall, I think this is fair. Prinz Eugen did have a very modern radar suit when she went to sea with Bismarck. In fact, she had the best the Germans could produce at the time. Norfolk didn't have the most up-to-date that Britain had in the works at the time, but that's more of a function of refit schedules. So she'd received an upgrade to her detection systems in 1940. But then the other consideration there is it gave the system time to break in and it was quite well adapted to use at sea. I think if we look at relative age of the system, then you could argue that Prinz Eugen enjoyed a marginal advantage over Norfolk. But it's very difficult with radar because you can talk a lot about specifications, but then different radars do behave differently in different conditions. They can be affected by where you mount them in the ship. They can be affected by vibration. I mean, Bismarck is a great example because she managed to knock her own radar out with shock from her guns, among other things. So I think for the purposes of the game and representation, I'm actually quite happy with the differing radar ratings that they've both been given. What about hull and protection? Again, Prinz Eugen's got an advantage there. I would actually completely agree with that. Because not only did Prinz Eugen benefit from much better subdivision than Norfolk, she had significantly better capacity to absorb flooding. In fact, it was this subdivision that was part of the reason for her having such a noticeably lower fuel endurance, because subdividing your hull for watertight capacity is not always, it's not always compatible with good fuel storage. The two sometimes clash. But in this regard, flood control and watertight subdivision, Prinz Eugen was noticeably better than Norfolk. And not only that, she enjoyed better protection in terms of armour. So the British county class were, for their size, I would say almost terrifyingly under armoured. And I suppose widening the discussion to armour and protection, it's worthwhile thinking about the protection to her turrets as well. So again, Prinz Eugen's got a better rating in game terms than Norfolk. So Norfolk, like a lot of the other counties, had virtually no armour on the expanse of her hull. This is the scary bit. So I'm just going to bring that big picture back. A lot of that hull that you see there is unprotected other than by basic steel plating. Where she did have protection was where it really counted. So her ammunition handling spaces and magazines were protected by 4 inches of armour on the side and 1 inch on the top. The turrets, the turret ring bulkheads, and the side protection to the turrets, and again the ammunition handling spaces, that was protected by 1 inch of armour. But again, whoa, terrifyingly thin. Let's crunch some of the numbers for Prinz Eugen, and you'll note an interesting difference here. Because the British are on the US Navy side, they haven't gone overboard with elaborating on her protection, but you can see the turrets are dark and the rest of the ship is depressingly light. Now, they've given the same treatment to Prinz Eugen here, but luckily for us, they've included a breakdown of her side armour as well, which shows that she had a much more complete protection scheme than the British counties in general and Norfolk in particular. So she had a belt, as you can see, waterline and lower hull belt armour, and that varied in thickness from about somewhat over 3 inches to roughly 1.5 inches at the bow and the stern. She had a complete armoured deck, or a nearly complete armoured deck, which, unlike Norfolk, which didn't have one at all. And the thickness varied from about 1.25 inch plating to maybe 1/2 inch at its thinnest. So she had that level of splint, I'll call it splinter protection, really. Now, another area she did better than Norfolk is that she had dedicated torpedo bulkheads inboard of the hull. And although the plating of these was quite thin, it was less than an inch thick, so really not that much better than standard plating. But the fact is, she still had that second line of flooding defense inboard of the side plating and the side armor. Her main turrets, they put Norfolk's absolutely to shame, at least on the faces they do. So whereas Norfolk's turrets, well, actually, no, I take that back. They put Norfolk's turrets to shame everywhere. So Prinz Eugen's turrets had front armour of over 6 inches, but it tapered to two and a smidge inches around the sides and the back. So that still makes them stronger everywhere than Norfolk. And lastly, the armoured conning tower and control spaces, another contrast to Norfolk, which didn't have an armoured control centre. Prinz Eugen has 6 inches on the face and sides and 2 inches at the rear. So she is a much, much better protected ship than Norfolk. If anything, I would say they've probably been slightly unkind to Prinz Eugen. I think the primary bow and stern armament ratings are fair. Her hull rating, between her better flood control capacity and the much better armor, I would suggest she deserves another hull box. Now, of course, if I'm playing the game as the British, I would say no such thing. But for the purposes of this exercise, they have made her a tiny bit on the wimpy side. So maybe poor Prinz Eugen needs a bit more passive defense. Lastly, of course, there is the armament itself. Now, I think this may suggest a reason why they've only given Prinz Eugen 5. So you're sorry, only given her one more than Norfolk. So when it comes to the armament, this is not just a function of their protective rating, but also the strength of the armament. So Prinz Eugen does have an edge here. And I think this is probably deserved. In terms of the gun battery, they actually had a completely identical armament. On the face of it, eight-inch guns in twin turrets, as we've seen, disposed two forward, two aft. Now, what makes the difference here and why I think Prinz Eugen's been given an advantage is that her guns were much newer and significantly more modern than Norfolk's. And the same is true of her loading systems as well. So she could manage a slightly faster rate of fire, not a hugely faster one, but you would notice. And I think it's also a nod to gunnery control. German optics were probably a bit better than what Norfolk. I mean, if you're comparing Prinz Eugen and Norfolk, again, her optics and targeting systems would probably get her a solution on Norfolk faster than the British warship could retaliate. Now, of course, once the Norfolk did retaliate, Prinz Eugen would probably notice. But yes, I think on balance, the way they've done it is pretty fair. I do also understand that in gaming terms, because there are so many British cruisers out there of Norfolk's ilk, you've got to give Prinz Eugen something, and I don't think that breaks the game any, giving her that extra. Certainly not as much of a game breaker as giving her way more torpedoes than poor Norfolk has. So yes, quite happy with the armament, I think. It does also explain why the armament doesn't have another hull box, despite its much better survivability and protective arrangements, because that would have made her a little bit too powerful. So lastly, let's get to fuel endurance. That's the only thing we've got to address. So of course, Prinz Eugen has a rating of 9 and Norfolk has a rating of 10. I do think this is fair. Dimensionally, of course, Prinz Eugen, as you can see, they've helpfully, I'll zoom back in, they've helpfully given us the dimensions here. And of course, a ship's size, although a lot depends on what they do with the internal arrangements, it does inevitably have a bearing on how big your fuel bunkerage capacity is. Now, the British, when they design cruisers, always give them as much range as they possibly can, but they also accept that they can't go mad with it, which is fine because the British Empire spans the globe and you have fueling bases everywhere. So, in a sense, British cruisers can happily charge around burning their fuel, knowing that if there's a problem, wherever they are on the planet, they're likely to have somewhere they can put into. So Norfolk meets a lot of the design criteria in that period, and it was still true in the 1940s. The British had a lot of places that they could top their ships up, get repaired at. So Norfolk's fuel limitation of, well, it's 10 units in this game, so probably gave us something like, I would say it translates to about 8 to 9,000 nautical miles if you're being very economical and steaming slowly. Prinz Eugen, of course, is not too far behind her British cousin, but when you consider there's no friendly German bases and maybe just a handful of tankers in pre-arranged locations that you can top off from, that suddenly becomes a major hobbling factor. But even so, Prinz Eugen wasn't too shabby in this department. And as you can see, I think that's a fair comparative rating because she wasn't too far behind the British ship in terms of overall fuel capacity. What you do see happening here is her paying the price for the strengths of her design in other areas. So although the Germans have, noticeably more space to play with, they've had to reduce the fuel capacity because of the other benefits that have been built into the ship. And I think this game illustrates that quite nicely, if indirectly, because yeah, you've got a very capable heavy cruiser that on paper can take any of her likely, equivalent opponents in a 1-to-1. But there's certain areas where she has to pay the price for that. So overall, my thoughts are that this game, and I do love this game, so I hate picking holes in it because it's a really wonderful game. I think overall the representation of the two ships is very fair. I think that Green, as he did so often before, did a marvelous job of balancing, staying true to the reality of what these ships were and how effective they were. But at the same time, he's managed to work in enough of a difference and enough capability to give the Germans, who are numerically the much weaker side, a bit more of a chance. And of course, no denying Prinz Eugen as a much younger cruiser would naturally be better than Norfolk, because although the German shipbuilding industry had lost a lot of its sense of progress because of the reduction in their warship building in at the end of the First World War, and their very slow comeback from that place of, well, virtually they had to start from scratch again. It's a very good effort. The British, of course, were just building. They were continuing a process of design which had been pretty steady, and they were also fulfilling a different strategic function. This is the other thing. When the British settle for things that may seem a bit odd, it's very often because they're fronting strategy, even sometimes at the cost of tactical elements. So yes, so we've got two very nicely balanced and very well treated ships there. The only sore point, as I've probably laboured ad nauseum, is the torpedoes. Norfolk really deserves better than that. And I may, next time I play this game, I may, just because I want to, give her the battery she deserves, 8 torpedoes. But I think I've gone on long enough. I've realised this having blathered on about short videos, I've run into 40 minutes plus. So I'm going to call this one there. But thank you all so much for tuning in to this. I hope you've enjoyed this. And as always, comments most welcome. I know these two ships are quite well known and they both have their fans. So if I've said anything wildly crazy, then I really look forward to getting corrections or just hearing from you. Any comment welcome. I will try to answer as soon as I can. But just to say thank you all very much. I really appreciate the time you take watching these, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed making it. Whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thank you so much, and I really look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye.